Good evening, everybody. I have this really lousy reputation of starting on time at school. And sometimes my students don't appreciate that very much, but, you know. Let's begin with a moment of prayer. If we would, let's pause. Dear God, we thank you for the blessing of early evening when we come together and reflect and meditate on what it is to live a holy life. We thank you for this community that holds us accountable and sustains us with your grace and your spirit and transforms us into sanctified people. Bless us tonight as we look at a very hard set of issues about war and peace, and we ask a special blessing on our conversation tonight, and allow us as a community to be indeed a city set on a hill, a community that is in fact salt to the wider community. In these things we pray in Jesus' name, amen. I just got off a plane a few hours ago from having spent the last 5 days in Yellowstone National Park.
So you do not need to feel sorry.
Right. I brought my PR person with me. But as I was flying back, actually as I left this morning, I thought, you know, to come back and to talk about the ethics of war and peace is a little strange given where I've been. But on the other hand, it dawned on me that if the world's leaders could just spend 5 days together in a place like Yellowstone, then maybe it would actually be a much more peaceful planet. And so I'm particularly mellow tonight, even though we're looking at a belligerent topic, and I hope that our conversation goes well. When I give this lecture, which I've done many times, I often begin by reflecting on a very lonely evening in my early life in January of 1975. And those of you who are men of a certain age, you may recall when you turned 18 during a certain period in American history, and that was the Vietnam War. When I turned 18 in the small town of Paducah, Kentucky, I had to go downtown to the downtown post office about 3 blocks from the Ohio River, and I had to register with the local Selective Service Board. Now, if I had been born 6 weeks later, I was born in 1957 in January. If I had been born 6 weeks later, I would not have had to have made that pilgrimage. I was in the last group of men that had to register when they turned 18. Now, the good news was at that point, Mr. Ford and Mr. Kissinger had stopped drafting 19-year-olds, but they were still taking names and addresses just in case they decided to turn the draft back on. So I didn't face the pressure that my older brother did. My brother, who was 3 years older than I was, had to register, and he actually got a very high draft lottery number. Those of you of a certain age may remember that. He was in the mid-200s, and so he in essence, was not vulnerable to the draft. But I remember going down and signing a form that promised that I would forever keep the draft board of Paducah, Kentucky, aware of my current mailing address. Now, I have to confess that's one pledge I've not kept. I don't think the draft board's meeting with any regularity but I can remember the astounding sense of loneliness I felt the day I turned 18, because I had to go and make that ritual pilgrimage downtown to the post office, and I had no one to talk to about what I was thinking and feeling. Now, that's very ironic. My father was a Navy pilot, was a seaplane pilot, that's hard to say, seaplane pilot, in World War II. And had seen the world, and it had changed his life. And so he with 3 boys, was very patriotic, but troubled by the Vietnam War, but not troubled enough to tell his children, you shouldn't go. But vexed enough, as any caring parent would have been in that era. But we really couldn't have a conversation about should I register with the draft board, and if I were drafted, should I go or not? That just was not the conversation I was going to have with my father. And doubly ironic then was in the church I grew up in, having grown up in a conservative evangelical environment, in a denomination that had been pacifist once upon a time back in World War I. There was nobody I could talk to about that question. You could ask the question, is it legitimate for a Christian to fight in the military? Nobody criticized an 18-year-old for asking that question. But after about 90 seconds of sort of hemming and hawing, the answer was, well, sure, it's not a problem, go ahead. But there wasn't a way for an 18-year-old to work through doubts that you might have about this particular conflict. And certainly in 1975, most of the American public had severe and deep reservations about the Vietnam War. American public opinion had turned against that war by 1975, and we were on the way out. So I didn't face the crux of that. But I can recall telling myself, if I ever find myself in a position like this where I know 18-year-olds who wrestle with a similar sort or similar set of questions about war and peace, I want to be able to be there for them so they can have the conversation with me or somebody that we might know. So no 18-year-old should have to face that set of questions alone. And so what I'm doing tonight is, in essence, trying to answer my own 18-year-old self, if you'll allow me to do that. I'm sort of having the conversation with myself that I wish I'd been able to have back in 1975. So having said that, that gives you a little kind of the personal stake and personal background, I feel, with respect to these issues. Now, broadly speaking, in the history of Christian teaching on war and peace, there have been three different perspectives that Christians at different eras have brought to the question of, can Christians legitimately use lethal force? And the first of these is the original position, and that's of pacifism, based on the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus says there about, turning the other cheek and not repaying evil for evil. The early church, in its first couple of centuries of existence, was clearly pacifist. Now, many of us don't realize that, but that was, in fact, the original position of the church. Then, in the late 4th century, early 5th century, arose what we now know as the just war ethic, which argued, as we're going to concentrate mainly on tonight, that under a limited set of circumstances, under limited conditions, it would be permissible for Christians to think about the use of lethal force as an act of justice. Then you fast forward a few more centuries beyond the 5th century, and we get to the Holy War or Crusade tradition, where actually in the name of Christ, it was seen to be legitimate to go to war, particularly with Muslims at that point. Now, I'm going to do the arbitrary thing that professors are allowed to do, and I'm simply going to say I'm not going to defend the Holy War Crusade tradition tonight. Okay, I'm going to rule that one out of bounds, and if you're a crusader or a holy warrior, we can maybe not meet in the parking lot, maybe in the narthex afterwards to talk about that, but I'm simply going to say that's not a viable option today, and I'm just going to lop that one off, and I'm happy to talk about that if that's a particular interest of yours, but tonight I want to talk about more the just war ethic. Now, ironically, in my experience as an adult, when Christians deal with the prospect of particular wars, pardon me just a moment. Despite these three historic Christian positions, when Christians talk about this conflict or that conflict specifically, we tend to use the pragmatic political realism that reduces most armed conflicts to calculations of American national interest. In other words, we tend to replicate the secular discourse. We tend not to think as Christians as we approach those questions. And it's deeply troubling to me as an ethicist, and it's also deeply ironic that for people who want to be a holy people, who want to view the world we live in through theological and biblical lenses, when we find ourselves confronted as Americans in particular with analyzing particular conflicts or theoretical conflicts, we almost always fall back on the secular political analysis that's around us, and we tend to sort of shed our Christian skin when we talk about it. And I think that's troubling, and I think that's unfortunate. So what I want to do tonight is concentrate on this middle option, that is the just war ethic. And ironically, you hear this used sometimes in the sort of wider discourse, but it's sort of like the New Testament. It's often invoked in churches, but it's really not often used very much. And that's unfortunate. What I'm going to do tonight then is set out the major components and draw a few conclusions. And it always, if you have questions as I go along, please shoot up a hand. And I realize I go too fast sometimes and I get kind of involved in my own lecture, but I'm happy to stop. I'm happy to camp out if something's unclear and do the sort of back and forth. So please raise your hand at any time. And I will stop, I hope, with plenty of time left to engage as we did last time in an extended question and answer session. Now, if I were to draw these three traditions in kind of a continuum form, I call this the truth in advertising moment, sort of tell you where I am at the beginning. Some ethicists think about charting these three positions as a continuum, with pacifism on one end, crusade on the other end, and then in this vast middle, the just war ethic. And if I were to locate myself in this continuum, I would locate myself about here. In other words, I'm closer to the pacifism pole, but I'm actually in the just war territory. There are some just war ethicists who, frankly, are closer to this side. And this will become clearer as I elaborate what the just war ethic is comprised. I'm not going to, I'll elaborate this in a moment, but this is where I'm actually located. I would be a pacifist, except for some really hard cases that I know of in history, where I think actually not engaging in lethal force may lead to grave injustice on a large scale. And we don't have to go too far back, at least in American history, to think of some examples where that's the case. And if we didn't have those hard cases, I might be over here, but we'll get into that in a moment. But in terms of the relationship then, I'm just across this boundary away from pacifism into the just war ethic. And I just thought it might be helpful for you to know where I stand in the face of all that. The best way to think about the just war ethic is then to see it as a broad historic tradition. People think about the theologian Augustine as being the first person there at the late 4th century, the turn of the 5th century, as the theologian who began to codify a theological move that allowed Christians to think about in a deeply biblical way why it might be permissible under exceptional circumstances to resort to lethal force. Whereas before Augustine in the church, there really wasn't a lot of well-articulated rationales for overriding this original pacifism of the church, and we're going to take that apart in just a moment. Now, what I'm going to give you in the next few minutes is really a contemporary version of this tradition. And if you think about Augustine, you have other figures like Thomas Aquinas, you have people like Grotius and the Spanish scholastics, and then up in our day, people like Paul Ramsey, who was a United Methodist ethicist, and John Courtney Murray. It's been Christians which have kept the just war tradition alive. Now, one doesn't have to be a Christian to use the just war ethic, so you may in fact know folks who have no theological orientation, who may be secular, they may be Jewish, they may come from other orientations who do use the just war ethic. So you don't have to be a Christian to use the criteria I'm going to give you, but historically it's important to note that Christians were the ones who are the carriers of this tradition. They're the ones who articulated it and applied it in different historical contexts. And had Christian theologians not done that, we wouldn't have anybody today thinking or talking about the just war ethic. So in many ways, it's the gift of the church, if you will, to the wider world. In 1959, a Catholic theologian who you've heard me refer to a couple of times, John Courtney Murray, wrote an essay about the state of moral thinking about war. So it's 1959, and think about this. This is only 14 years after the end of World War II. This is just after the beginning of the nuclear age, and the Soviet Union has now acquired not only atomic weapons, but also the hydrogen bomb. And it's the beginning of really the height of the Cold War and the realization that human beings might actually possess the ability to end life as we knew it. And the nuclear age was beginning to reach its sort of terroristic heights. And Murray said, you know, we have this tradition in the church, but we haven't used it very often. And he said, frankly, if you look at World War II, there was very little moral analysis of either how the war was prosecuted or why we went to war in the first place. And he found it deeply ironic that the church had this tool, this set of gifts, if you will, to analyze war, and we had completely ignored it in what might have been the most dangerous military adventure in human history just a few years before. And he said if you resurrect this tradition from its medieval and ancient roots, it can do two things for us. He said, number one, it can help us as individuals make up our minds about specific conflicts. Now, my hunch is, for those of you who are over the age of like 6 in this room, you have faced different kinds of potential warfare that America was potentially involved in, that are radically different. In other words, the Vietnam War was different from Iraq. So we face, at least I faced in my lifetime, questions of what do I think about this war? What do I think about that war? What do I think about this potential conflict? And the just war ethic is going to be a tool that helps us as individuals assess what we really think about the potential ethical traps or advantages to different kinds of conflicts. It's nice to have something that allows you to assess different kinds of moral dilemmas. And that's one thing Murray said the ethic can do. The second thing he says it can do is it can actually structure a debate, a public debate. Now, the analogy I use, in the neighborhood I grew up in, we played a lot of baseball, the boys in my neighborhood. But you know, we never had a baseball game that lasted more than about 2.5 innings. You know why? Argument. We didn't agree on the rules. Where was the foul ball? Where was the home run? Who calls you safe or who calls you out? And so after, if we made it to 3 innings, the heavens opened and the doves came down because a miracle had occurred. Because we didn't have anybody to set the rules and parameters for how to adjudicate our differences. And so it resorted to fists or somebody taking home the bat and the ball, and it ended. Now, I don't know about you, but in the last 10 or 15 years in the United States, you think about what we faced about going into Iraq or going into Afghanistan. And if you turned on the television, you saw the electronic version of my childhood baseball games. People yelling, people screaming, people talking past each other, and there was no agreed set of rules to talk about those conflicts. There was no public discourse from a moral perspective, at least, that I saw much of with respect to Iraq or Afghanistan. And I so desperately wished we had somebody to say, well, here are a set of guidelines that maybe can structure a conversation about war. Now, it may not yield consensus, and the just war ethic doesn't yield consensus, so maybe it's not a good model in your mind. But Murray said it does these two things. It helps you as an individual assess what you think about a specific conflict. But it also establishes sort of a forum, a set of rules that govern a conversation so you don't end up fighting with each other at the end of the 3rd inning, but maybe you can actually have the full conversation and everybody gets in. And then as a nation, perhaps, we can make well-informed moral decisions rather than the chaos that we've seen in our public discourse in recent years. Now, once Murray said that, he said when you drill down into the ethic itself, he says the ethic does 3 things for us. Number 1, historically, if you read all the just war ethicists, they condemn war as evil. Christians are very realistic that war is never a good condition to be in. We should never feel comfortable because evil things happened, even in the cases of just wars. Unintentionally, people die who are not supposed to die. Nations are destroyed. Economies evaporate. Cities are burned and destroyed. And so there is evil that is entailed even in the most just of wars. And the tradition condemns evil, condemns war as evil. Secondly, it attempts to limit the evil that comes from war. So the just war ethic acknowledges that as sinful human beings, we are very conflictual. We tend to fall back into violence so very easily. And Christians should be about the business of trying to tamp down and limit and control that. And thirdly, the ethic seeks to humanize the conduct of war to the extent that's possible. So his view then is the ethic not only provides a means for us as individuals to form our moral conscience in the face of specific conflicts, but it helps us structure this necessary political debate over the moral justification for war. Now, Murray was very quick to add that at its best, when we talk about war, we are at the far borders of what is moral. And he used a German word, he's called it a Grenzmoral. It's a borderline ethic. So we should never assume that war is routine and that it's not morally dangerous, even if we think we're operating with justice and right on our side. We should be very uncomfortable as Christians because we are just right on the very border between what is good and what is evil. And Christians should never feel comfortable sitting on that boundary. You always hope you're on the right side of the boundary. but you should always be nervous that you're next to it. And so we never assume that war is a routine matter that Christians easily dismiss or easily accept. It's a borderline ethic. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and I think the best version of the just war ethic says there's actually a relationship here between pacifism and the just war ethic. If you know a pacifist, or if you are a pacifist, and if I ask you the question, can you envision any circumstances under which you can override Jesus' prohibition against the use of violence? And the pacifist says, no. So there's always a presumption against the use of force if you're here as a pacifist. The just war ethic shares that initial presumption against pacifism. If anybody comes to a Christian and says, hey, let's go to war against fill in the blank, the first Christian answer should always be no. Now, for the pacifist, that answer never changes. But for the just war ethic, it can envision some exceptional cases where you might override that initial presumption against the use of force. Now, let me give you an example of this. Think about the Beltway. Everybody here is familiar with the joys and travails of driving on the Beltway. The Beltway has a speed limit, which last time I checked was 55. Now, I haven't hit 55 on the Beltway in a long time, but that's my problem. All things being equal, if I were to ask you the question, should you violate the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, the answer is... All right, somebody's getting an F tonight in ethics, but so the presumption is no.
Okay, they got an A for honesty.
I'll get back to you on that. See, my students, this is interesting. Students always say, no, we can never, but this is a tougher crowd. Well, then, no, I know that dynamic. Trust me. No, I'm very familiar with that. However, I can envision circumstances under which I would violate that. I think one time we had a child on the way, and the last visit we had with the obstetrician was, this child is going to come in a hurry. Now, in the city we lived in at that time, we had a version of the Beltway. It wasn't 495, but it was 128. If she had gone into, now we induced and it all, we had a happy ending, so that's that story. But if I was driving on the Beltway and my wife was having contractions that were 3 minutes apart, and I had a fairly open highway to me to the hospital, to the delivery room, I would not be limited by the 55 mile an hour, because I don't want to see my next child being born in the car, and blood doesn't work with me in driving. It'd be doubly tragic. So I can think of circumstances where it would be permissible. And in fact, if a trooper pulled me over and said, why were you doing 80 miles back there? I'd say, well, my wife's about to give birth. He would turn on the blue lights and say, follow me. So even the law would recognize that there are exceptions to this normal prohibition against. So think of this as a presumption exception model. Christians of all stripes, I would argue, should have a presumption against war. However, some of us are open to hearing a case to be made for why we should override that presumption. And we're going to talk about what would constitute that case in just a moment. So it's very important that we don't lose, even those of us who are here, we don't lose sight of the fact that the original position of the church was a universal no to the use of force. That still has to carry weight today, even though we might be able to conceive of some limited exceptional circumstances when we would override that presumption. So it's good to have pacifists around. Now, what's interesting, in my classes many times, I have a hard time finding a student who will identify himself or herself as a pacifist. I often have to play that role in class, which makes, for an interesting dynamic. I'm not going to do that tonight. So within the just war ethic, the burden of proof, this is important, the burden of proof rests upon the person who would make the case for going to war, because the initial assumption is we don't endorse war until we've heard a compelling case. So the ethic shares a presumption against war with pacifism, but the presumption within the just war ethic is not absolute as it is within pacifism itself. Within the just war ethic, war is seen as a rule-governed exception to the initial presumption against war. Thus, war requires an explanation and a justification before it can be deemed just. So how do we make that decision? Well, the just war ethic gives us two sets of criteria that have to be met before we have a case for overriding this initial presumption against the use of force. And I'm going to go walk through those tests, and I'll write them up here as we go along. Everybody see that? Does that make sense? Is that fairly clear? Okay. So as we're trying to think about why we might override this presumption against the use of force, that's the first question is, well, why? Why might we think about and here, the ethics says there are some possible cases, some causes that might prompt us to think that this presumption against the use of force might be reconsidered. And here there are three traditional, what are called just causes. The first of these is to protect the innocent from an unjust attack. And this one is the most straightforward and simplest. This is the right to defend somebody who's being attacked by a guilty third party. And think about this. The example I often use, you're walking down the sidewalk in your neighborhood, and you see an adult physically attacking a preschooler. Shocking as though that might be, but I'm giving you a fairly clear-cut example here. And in that case, most of us would believe that no preschooler is capable of doing something so morally reprehensible that requires an adult to physically beat them, right? I mean, so I pick a fairly clear. Now, this is where it begins to get a little complicated. What Augustine argued that really triggered all of this, he asked the question, what would it mean as a Christian to love my neighbor if I found my neighbor in the circumstances of the child I just gave you? To be truly neighbor to that child, do I wait until the encounter is over and then provide aid? Or does the love of neighbor require me to intervene with enough force to save the innocent from an unjust attack? Augustine argued that as a form of neighbor-regarding love, as Jesus argues for it in the Sermon on the Mount and also the parable he talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, that it actually, love of Christ requires us to intervene. But then he threw a curveball in the middle of this. Augustine argued that we as individuals do not have the right to self-defense. So if somebody attacks me, I have to suffer the injustice of the attack. I have no right to self-defense. However, if I'm the party who walks along seeing that attack going on, I have a positive duty to intervene on the behalf of my neighbor. But where it gets really dicey, he said you can only intervene using enough force to repel the attacker. So if it takes me to pull out my cell phone and say, hey, buddy, I'm dialing 911 right now, you better stop. And if that effectively shuts down the attack and the person leaves, that is better than pulling out a gun and with no questions asked, shooting the adult who's doing the attacking. And Augustine said if you actually kill somebody when a lower degree of force would have been effective, I'm guilty of murder if I kill them in the act of intervening. So you take on tremendous moral responsibility if you intervene in this situation to protect the innocent from an unjust attack. You have the right to do it, but you have to calibrate the amount of force you use, or you too could be guilty of sin and evil because you overuse force. So you assume a tremendous responsibility if you do, in fact, intervene in these circumstances. And that's very, very sobering to think about. You have a positive duty to intervene, but you can't intervene with too much force. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So you begin to see this gets complicated very, very fast. And you need to think long and hard, or be trained to think, because sometimes you don't have time to react very quickly in these circumstances. But Augustine argued it is theologically possible to use force to protect an innocent from unjust attack. Now, later on in the just war tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas argued that we as individuals do, in fact, have the right to self-defense. Now, we might want to argue that one tonight. That's one that's not settled in the tradition, and you find ethicists argue back and forth about whether we as Christians possess the right to self-defense. But just where ethicists say we do have the right to intervene to protect innocents from unjust attack. Now, innocent can mean individual, it can mean groups, it can even mean a nation when you get into kind of a contemporary version. Think of this when Germany invaded Poland, for instance, really at the beginning of World War II. That was a case where innocents were being unjustly attacked, and maybe we want to drill down into that. Any questions about that? Any observations on that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So was Augustine's position, was he using turning cheese as his defense for not defending? I don't understand.
Yeah. No, so Augustine took very seriously the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, which it seems, at least at face value, not to empower me as an individual to respond with force if somebody attacks me. So that's how he honors the integrity he sees in Jesus' teaching, but he also honors what he sees in Jesus' teaching, saying maybe I have a duty to my neighbor. You know, one modern ethicist has said, think about the Good Samaritan. What if the Good Samaritan had come up during the attack and the beating? Would the Samaritan just sit there and watch and say, wow, this beating is really going on a long time. Yeah, okay, good, they're done now. I can go in and help. Or would the Samaritan, would he have intervened somehow to say, stop, go away, I'm calling the police, or whatever the options are for a Good Samaritan. So Augustine's trying to honor, in a sense, both sides of that coin, to say that it does look like Jesus disempowers us from self-defense, on a literal reading of the Sermon on the Mount. But then what does it mean to be neighbor to somebody who's being attacked within my field of vision? Do I simply just wait and say, well, you're supposed to take that beating too like I am, so I can't intervene and help you? Augustine said no, that you have a positive duty. If you really love that person who's the innocent, you have a positive duty to try and intervene and spare them. But you don't possess that right yourself. Now, that's a very tough sell in American society today. Let me just tell you. I have classroom after classroom full of pastors in training who just think, so it's complicated. And it's a very hard position to maintain. But I think there is some theological integrity in that. Now, I can sit here as a professor and say, I don't think I've ever, certainly after the age of 12, I've never faced a situation where I've had to decide about self-defense just because of the lucky path I have been on. So I'm in no position to judge people who've in fact acted in self-defense. And I'm not preaching judgment about that tonight. But that is something I think worth pondering. Yeah? Where did Bonhoeffer go? Well, as you know, Bonhoeffer in Discipleship seems to be pretty clear that not only do we not have a right to self-defense, he pretty much comes down on the pacifist side there. But as you know, then later in his life, he participates in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Now, obviously, something has evolved or changed in Bonhoeffer's thinking from the time he wrote Discipleship to the time he acted near the end of his life. And I would be hypothesizing if I gave it, which I'm happy to do. I'm a professor, right? I get paid to guess. I suspect what happened is he saw the extent of the evil that Hitler and National Socialism had perpetrated on Jews, on gypsies, on gays, on the handicapped. He knew that was going on. And I think he did a calculation that said this has to be stopped. Now, obviously, he was martyred for that belief, so we don't have his own sort of systematic account afterwards for what changed his thinking. I want to believe he moved into that middle zone of the just war ethic. Now, he also literally confronted the toughest case I can conceive of in terms of the incarnation of evil and the length to which human beings can display depravity through the use of war, and that would be Adolf Hitler.
But at the same time, he came back to the point of Augusta saying, you can't defend yourself.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Bonhoeffer had plenty of opportunities to parachute out of Germany. I mean, he made a conscious decision to stay. So there was no cheap grace in his answer. I mean, he did what he thought was right. He had a number of opportunities to leave Germany and find safe haven either in Britain or in the United States. I think he literally confronted the toughest case I can imagine, or toughest case I know of in human history, and he clearly made a different decision than maybe he would have earlier in his life. So I think it's the circumstances he found himself in, and I think he felt that God had called him to a different position. But that's a good one, yeah. Okay, two other quick things. Two other just causes, and I don't want to dwell on these. People might want to circle back to them, but this is certainly the main one that drives the just war ethic. The second one is to restore rights that have been wrongfully denied. And this opens up at least the theoretical possibility of a justified revolution. And then the third one is to restore basic order that's necessary for decent human existence. So once you have a just cause established, then the ethic asks really then a number of other questions that move us into more criteria. And let me simply go through these. So just because you have a just cause doesn't mean it's time to dial up the 101st Airborne and send them in. The world is full of evil. I mean, I can think tonight, I mean, we could brainstorm here. We could come up with a lot of places on the globe right now where these conditions obtain. So if you leap directly from just cause to firing up the 101st Airborne, guess what? They're always going to be in flight. It's because it is a very grave, dangerous, and evil globe that we live on. And this, at first glance, is sort of giving a carte blanche to say, go, launch, because there's evil everywhere. So the ethics says there are a number of other questions that really help answer when is it then wise to go to war. And I'm just going to work through these. The first of these must be right intention. And this comes straight from Augustine writing in The City of God. Because you know what he said? He said, if you look at humans, we have, and he has this wonderful phrase, a lust for domination. You know, and he even talks about little children. You watch little children play, and you can see this lust for domination at work. But then you think about nations and nation states. And human history is filled with kings who look over across their border and are jealous of their cousin who rules in the country next to them, and they want their oil, they want their land, they want their diamonds, they want their money, they want their horses. And that lust to dominate has led to most wars. So greed and hate and ambition and cruelty and vengeance are not morally sufficient motives for going to war. The right intention for fighting is a mournful sense of tragedy in the pursuit of justice and the reestablishment of peace. That's the only right intention that's permissible. As one ethicist wrote, the justifications for the institution of war rest upon its presumed utility as a necessary means of serving the common good by protecting the innocent from unjust attack, restoring rights wrongfully denied, or reestablishing a social order necessary for human existence. War is always a concession to sin, a restraint upon wrongdoing, a sanction against crime. But it is clearly a clumsy, inefficient, unpredictable, wasteful, and hideous form of sanction, a very faulty instrument of enforcement. Now, it's very hard to assess the intentions behind specific acts of war. What was he thinking when he launched those weapons? But nevertheless, it's important to pose the question to leaders who advocate war in specific cases to see what their intention is for going to war. And I think particularly in a representative democracy like our own, leaders owe the citizenry public justifications. And it's right for citizens to demand clear answers to why we are fighting. An ethicist down at University of Virginia has argued that this right intention notion applies not only to the original conflict, why we should go in, but it also applies throughout the conflict to particular battles and engagements and acts within war. Thus, if he's right, even in war, it's necessary to discern the real intentions on an ongoing basis. We need to listen to our leaders and hold our leaders accountable for why we continue to fight, not just why we went in the first place. So right intention is not simply dealing with something at the outset of hostilities, and that gets hard. As we know, wars have twists and turns, and it's difficult to maintain that, but it's very important to ask, why are we doing this? What is our intention behind this? Next, there is the criterion of proportionality. And here's where I start using my $10 words, okay? I like this. It's proportionality of ends. And roughly what this means is that the good you hope to achieve by going to war has to outweigh the evil that necessarily comes from going to war. Now, I have a silly example I use in the classroom. Let's say I'm lecturing, and in the middle of the lecture, I look back and I see a hornet. I see multiple hornets flying among the students. Now, personally, I hate hornets. I had an unfortunate childhood accident where my leg ballooned up, and, trust me, you don't want to hear the whole story. I don't like hornets, okay? So I'm in the middle of my lecture, and I see this, and I think, I need to end the reign of the hornets in my classroom. So being well-equipped as a professor, I reach down and I pull out a hand grenade from behind the podium. Pull the pin, smile at my students, throw it there, and then, of course, I duck, right? Now, the hand grenade goes off. Now, what happens to the hornets? No. This is an anti-hornet grenade, because I'm well prepared, okay? No more hornets. A great good to be celebrated. I don't have to fear them anymore. That's on the good side of the ledger for Shawn going to war in his classroom. But then the president and the dean of the seminary come in, and they start asking me questions, and they say, Shawn, we've got 30 dead students. Think of all that lost tuition revenue. And so you put that in the balance, and suddenly what I've done is disproportionate. It's a silly example, but it graphically shows you need. Now, the hard part is you have to weigh this before you go to war. So you're arguing about hypothetical consequences if you take an action. Now, I don't know about you, but my predictive abilities over time have not proven to be very strong. So good people of goodwill can argue this and disagree. And when we think about perhaps some wars or potential wars we have been involved in and debating, we know people disagree over whether the consequences will outweigh, the bad consequences will outweigh the good consequences. But counting the cost is very, very important. And many times in my personal experience, those who've gone to war tend to be the most cautious here because they know from personal experience how devastating war can be. This is in many ways a reality check on those who are chomping at the bit to go to war. You need to count the cost, fully acknowledging that people of goodwill can disagree about those projections, but it's wise and prudent to ask yourself this question and debate it at great depth. Then the third question is that of legitimate authority. And again, this goes back to Augustine as well. And the argument here is simply that only the political authority in a state has the right to go to war. I can't call in the Marines to deal with my cranky neighbor. Private citizens don't have the right to invoke war against any other party in our society or any other party around the globe. If we had that right, it would be even a bloodier globe than it currently is. So the decision to go to war has to reside in the legitimate authority. Now, we live in a democracy, right? So as citizens, we do have some say, although it's rarely a direct say, with respect to going to war. We have a constitutional system that says only Congress can declare war. Then we have this War Powers Act, which seems to give the president the right to do that. And we've had some narrow cases in our history where Congress and the president seem to be at odds with each other. So sometimes this arises as a question in our own democracy. It's where ultimately does that power reside? And I don't want to adjudicate that. I mean, I'm not a political scientist and I'm not a political theorist, but there have been cases just to observe where we have gone to war without congressional authorization and Congress has voted to authorize it, but the president has said, I don't need that, and if you'd voted against me, I'm still going to go. So we can think of cases where this might become truly a constitutional problem in our own polity. And the football kind of gets bounced around some, and I don't want to delve too deeply into that. But at this point, certainly the Constitution says the Senate, Congress has the power, but we also have the War Powers Act, which Congress passed, which authorizes the president to go to war in the short term and then notify Congress and ask for authorization after a certain amount of time has passed. So this can get fuzzy and conflictual. But the point I simply want to make here is that I think we have a duty as Christians to participate in the kind of moral deliberation that's required here so part of that legitimate authority resides with us. And I think it's safe to say that in the American, at least in my experience in American political history, when the country as a whole has turned against a war, in Vietnam, I guess would be the classic case out of my adolescence, it became much, much harder for a series of presidents to prosecute that war. So if there's not popular political support in the country for a war, it's very difficult for our commander-in-chief to continue to fight the war if that erosion takes place on the domestic front. The fourth criterion is that of last resort. And this one is extremely important. You can answer all of these questions. But the argument here is that every peaceable means available of addressing the conflict has to have been tried and exhausted before it's time to go to war. Only strict necessity can legitimate the resort to force. Now, if you're in the military business and it's your job to plan the attack, that can be very frustrating to you because your job is to prevail if in fact you get called on by the president or by the Congress to go in. But the military is actually not part of the political deliberation. And this one is hard because the longer you wait, from a military perspective, that's more time for your enemy to get prepared. And so you understand that pressure. If you're the person charged with getting the military forces ready, you can understand why you don't like this. But the power of this is it's a very powerful brake to stop any quick resort to war. You have to explore. Now, people can argue, and people have argued, over when do we actually reach this? I err on the side of waiting another day. Other people err on the side of not waiting another day. But it's worth pondering, have we arrived at a situation where a strict necessity has resulted? So in other words, there are no optional wars from the just war ethics perspective. If you can fight, but maybe not fight, and you're not compelled because of necessity, the just war ethic says you have not reached last resort. Now, over the history of the just war ethic, there have been people who've said, well, let's just erase this one. Let's ignore this one. And as an ethicist, when somebody says, let's throw out that rule, my radar always goes off. When somebody wants to jettison a rule, my question is, why are you so quick to want to get rid of that? And in this case, I think we need to hold on to it because this gives us pause and causes us to explore and see if indeed there are not other mechanisms that we need to employ before we actually go to war. And then there's one final criterion, and that is reasonable hope of success. And the crux of the argument here is that no political leader has the right to send his or her forces into suicide. No political leader has the right to send his or her forces into what would clearly be suicide or defeat. You don't possess that right if you're the leader of a nation. Now, when you take all of these criteria together, just cause, intention, proportionality of ends, legitimate authority, last resort, reasonable hope of success, we have this wonderful term to describe these criteria, and they're called the jus, you're getting a little Latin tonight, ad bellum criteria. That is justice toward war. That before you can have a just war, you have to satisfy these criteria. You have to have a just cause, you have to have right intention, you need to believe there's going to be a proportionality of ends, that it's being waged by legitimate authority, it's being waged as a last resort, and you think there's going to be a reasonable chance of success. Now, if you want to start a fight among ethicists, ask them, well, how about 4 out of 5? How about 3 out of 5? Where do you, I'm a 6 out of 6 guy, okay? My belief is if you can't demonstrate a compelling case in all of these, you do not have the right to go to war. You got to bat 1,000 in my book. Now, again, as I pointed out, people of goodwill can disagree here, and people of goodwill can disagree here too, because again, you're being asked to weigh future consequences, and smart people and good people can disagree on this because you're arguing about potential future consequences, and nobody has an infallible view into the future. But if you don't have a clear case here, my argument is you do not have a case for a just war. And there you begin to see that this ethic is a restraint on war. Going back to my baseball analogy, if we had had the real rule book of baseball and we had played under the notion that we had to observe all of those rules and we had an umpire who adjudicated those, we might have actually finished some games in my childhood instead of ending up in chaos like we always did. So I am an advocate of having to make a fairly compelling case across all of these criteria before you have a case for a just war. Yes, sir.
Where does uncertainty come in? Because you could always say, well, you're never going to win certainty.
Right. Yeah. Well, I used to say back in there was a certain political era when politicians talked about unfunded mandates being, unjust, and my argument was always, well, life is an unfunded mandate. We don't have certitude. None of us possesses moral certitude. So if you're looking for a set of criteria that generate certitude, you're not going to find them. We are incapable as finite human beings. The only person who has certitude is in fact God, and we clearly are not. So what this does is it doesn't give you certitude. But what it does, it gives you a set of lenses to generate data from which you can make a prudent or a wise decision. And that's, now, the pacifists can tell you certitude is over here with the pacifists. If you're looking for certitude, become a pacifist. Now, the pacifists I know struggle mightily with that because they see the horror that goes on that might be preventable. So they actually suffer in their certitude. So certitude's not always kind of what it's cracked up to be, if that makes any sense. So unfortunately, I wish as an ethicist I could give you Christian certitude here about whether going to war in any case is just or not just. But despite my best efforts, I haven't been able to deliver on certitude in any realm in my family life or professional life. So I mean, it's a great question. I wish we had it. Exactly. So if we... Exactly. So that is a very wise observation. Now think about it. If you're the President of the United States, and you're facing a potential conflict, you would love to have certitude. Every president who's ever served would love to have had certitude in the face of the question of going to war or not. None of them have had it. Or some of them maybe thought they had it, but history probably proved them wrong. What this does is I think it generates wisdom. But wisdom shouldn't be confused with certitude, because wise people have done dumb things too. That's a lousy meandering answer to a great question. Yes, sir.
Start off a little bit with the nuclear option.
Yeah.
We're the enemy, and we're firing on. And you're retaliating the nuclear option. It's
Right.
no win all the way around.
Right. I actually was learning this at the height of the nuclear era. And I actually wrote my dissertation under probably the best ethicist of the nuclear. So, that's a warning. I could go on for hours, and I'll try not to. My major professor, who I wrote my dissertation for, wrote the U.S. Catholic bishops' response to the nuclear question, which they published under the title "The Challenge of Peace" in 1983. And I'll give you the short version of this. The Catholic bishops concluded that nuclear deterrence, as it existed in the early 80s, was in fact not a morally acceptable position. However, then the question becomes, okay, what are you going to do? You need to stop. Tom, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm doing this, and you say that's in light of the Bible, that's not a good place to be, usually the response is, well, you stop that. Well, in the nuclear dilemma, if we unplugged all of our nuclear weapons, the consequences of that in 1983 could have been catastrophic. So then the question is, well, how do you back out? Sometimes we find ourselves in such complicated moral positions, we can't just simply quit today, but we have to back out slowly. And that's what the bishops started to argue, that nuclear deterrence is only conditionally morally acceptable. And part of the conditionality was that we look for ways to ratchet down from the nuclear precipice that we were on, that we should not try to maintain the status quo, we need to back down. And thankfully, that's what has happened. If you go back to that era, there were over 50,000 weapons on each side, nuclear weapons, and now we're down, we're getting in the realm of the hundreds. So you can argue we're moving towards a position where nuclear deterrence is no longer what it once was. And it's better to be where we are in 2012 than where we were in 1983. Now, I would argue you can't squeeze nuclear weapons into this. You can't. Now, there were people who said, well, you've got to be able to make them fit. And so some of the early ethicists of the nuclear age thought, well, okay, these are big weapons, but we can make them fit into this. And it just never worked. And that's where the bishops finally said, look, we can't squeeze the facts of nuclear weapons into this. So that's a great question.
What if the other side is not reasonable? What if you got Iraq or North Korea or something?
Well, let me make it a little more complicated, but hold me to that question. There are two other criteria that apply once you go to war, which makes your question even more relevant. As ethicists, we're never content. We're always kind of putting our noses in the middle of things. So we have a different set of criteria called the jus in bello, and this is justice in war. And there are two criteria here. One is proportionality of means. And what this says is you should never use more force than is necessary to achieve your tactical goals. So think back to the example I gave you about the innocent child being beaten by an adult. If a cell phone call is sufficient, pulling a weapon, a handgun, and using a handgun, no questions asked, is disproportionate. It's use of too much force. So it means you have this terribly hard job of calibrating your response. So if you're tasked with capturing a village, calling in an airstrike may be too much force because you may kill everybody in the village. You have to find a proportionate, if there's one to be found, you look for a proportionate response that preserves the village at the lowest cost of your own personnel. Now, again, you can calculate incorrectly. You may not use enough force, and you may have to come back a second time with more force, and that's the terrible moral burden that is on commanders in the field. And make no mistake that they are in a very, very difficult moral situation. But the person who says, oh, let's just turn it into a parking lot and not worry about discussions of proportionality may in fact be gravely wrong, because there were solutions available with less force, and that would be an unjust use. Now, the second one is what's called, there are two terms for this, either discrimination or non-combatant immunity. And what this means is you cannot directly target civilians. Now, ultimately, civilians may die in any act of war. But if you say, you know, there's one bad guy in this audience and I'm going to take out the whole audience to get that one bad guy, that ignores discrimination. You don't discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Now, to your question, people have asked, well, what if the other guys don't observe these niceties? Terrorists don't observe. In fact, terrorists trade on this. Their job is to create terror by literally making non-combatants feel nervous. Now, my answer to that, and this is not my answer, is that doesn't relieve me of the moral duties implied here, because the other people don't play fairly. Now, that means... Mm-hmm.
Then that's a factor that's part of that decision making.
Right. Yeah, and I think this was part of the problem in Vietnam, where the American population, I think, at least in my read, began to turn against the Vietnam War when they thought they were watching some indiscriminate responses, where there might be a few Viet Cong people living in one South Vietnamese village, and South Vietnamese civilians were paying a price with their lives and their material in the hunt for the Viet Cong that we thought might be living in their midst. And so the belief was that we were using, sometimes disproportionate means, but particularly we were not sufficiently discriminating between combatants. And now the truth is, if you're looking at an audience and the combatants are wearing civilian clothes, that puts a horrible burden on the regular military trying to ferret that out. Now, there were some ethicists who argued, hey, if you're going to play by those rules, we can play by those rules too, and everybody's a combatant. Just as a footnote, and I don't want to dwell on this, this is part of the controversy today about the use of drones by our own military now in places like Pakistan, Yemen, and other places where, and again, I don't want to start a food fight here tonight, but I think it is a very important question and a vexing question, and one that I'm still trying to work through myself. Are we observing sufficiently non-combatant immunity here? And let me just say that's an open argument, and that's one that's going to be ongoing, and one you're going to be hearing more about. Tom.
So, since the church historically has been a resource to the Catholics around the world,
Mm-hmm.
are there current ethicists who are dealing with the technology of warfare changing? Because historically, I'm not studying war, but the only known figure I can think of that is compared with modern time is Genghis Khan, who routinely used civilian populations to confound his enemies and destroy them, without any problem at all. So then you take modern warfare, as Andy pointed out, with terrorists. Well, a drone attack is actually it does demonstrate proportionality.
Right.
But not to the home it attacks.
That's correct.
Then it has no discrimination.
That's correct.
So then on the news, you've got the situation with the civilians that are dead, along with 8 terrorists.
Right.
And 3 children and
That's right.
women. So are there current ethicists that are keeping abreast of the changes in warfare technology and running towards that?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this is the fierce debate. Now, the really fascinating thing is what's changed from the Vietnam era to contemporary days in our military. To give you one example, the U.S. Air Force invests tremendous resources today in trying to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. I had a student who's now a UMC pastor who was a colonel. He was a lawyer, and this was his job, to run a team for Iraq and Afghanistan, to look at the intelligence to say, okay, we want to take out that mud hut, third door down on the right. Do we have permission to do that? And this legal team, that is what they did full time, was to say yes or no, based upon the target being combatant or non-combatant. So the Air Force, it's just one example, expends tremendous energy in trying to make this decision. So there are discussions going on within the military, there are discussions going on among ethicists trying to sort all of this out. Now the good news is we're trying to sort this out. There was an era when I think that was much less of a concern back 40, 50 years ago. So that's the good news, is the debate is going on. I don't think there's going to be a clean, neat ending to that anytime soon. I'll come to you in just a moment. Let me say a couple more things. Ethicists, we have the luxury of coming along after the fact. Okay, that's the comfortable position to say, you know, there were people who wanted to ban the bow and arrow. Because think about it. Prior to this, it was just sword fight and knife fight at close quarters, and suddenly you're telling me the guy's a quarter mile away can kill me with this stupid little piece of wood and string and a stick of wood? That doesn't sound very proportionate to me. People wanted to ban the bow and arrow. Then you get to, you know, the repeating rifle. So technology is going to evolve. Ethics oftentimes has to catch up with that. The nuclear age then is the other big evolution, where suddenly we had these weapons that could do things that we had never seen before. And the ethicists frankly had very lousy answers to those questions. So the good news is, what I see going on is that people of goodwill are wrestling very, very hard because they want to honor this notion of non-combatant immunity. And that's very hard when you're playing against a group of people who don't like your rules, who laugh at your rules, and employ techniques that are in fact premised on not observing those rules. Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
I was just going to support you and say that in Iraq and Afghanistan, every Army brigade has a team of lawyers that are right there advising the commander on the rules of engagement.
That's right.
See that they don't do something illegal.
That's correct. Now, I also think, I was part of a war game, gosh, 5 years ago. And there was a Marine trainer in the room. And so he gets them post-basic training and before they ship. I forgot what you call that interim period. Somebody here probably knows. It's not long. And he said, and so part of it, he said, my first job is to try to help them not get killed, number one. You take a 19-year-old straight out of high school, and you're going to be throwing them in that environment, which is, you know, counter-terror, counterinsurgency warfare, just unthinkably dangerous. But then in addition, I've got to train them on how to observe the rules of engagement, which may change tonight compared to yesterday. And I've had a 19-year-old male in my family. I mean, this is, you know, again, I think last week I said the 13-year-old male mind's a scary thing. The 19-year-old male mind can be a scary thing too. But we have to train those young men and women to be able to adapt rules of engagement from one day to the next. That is an extraordinarily high moral burden to put on them. I personally am thankful they wrestle with that, as opposed to saying, yeah, I'll shoot anything that moves. Don't worry about that. So thank you. I appreciate it. You had a...
I just had actually two kind of questions. The first one was, it seems to me that things aren't really linear. I mean, you're not start at A and end. In other words, that right intention proportionality ends, it seems to me, would also apply to discrimination. I mean, at some point, none of them are really a yes, no. And so it's more of a relationship thing. That was my first question. And the second question is, I know that this is war, but it would seem to me that these are things that we wrestle with for police. And anybody that has authority and the ability to kill, I guess.
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right. These are, and that's why, I mean, I like the framework of the presumption is against the use of force, number one. And number two, the burden on the person the burden is on the person wanting to use force to make a case, make a defensible case. And I want to keep the barriers high. I really don't want them to be low. Even though I understand the pressure, if you're that soldier on patrol, I understand why you might want to err on the side of shoot first, ask questions later. I get that. But I think if we need to maintain as high barriers as possible, acknowledging that there will be legitimate cases, I think, where force, in fact, is called for. But I do take your point. I mean, so I think it's important. I think it's morally beneficial for anybody in a position of leadership, particularly where force is a possibility, to think, if not exactly like this, to think analogously that there should be rules governing our use of force when we possess power that may inflict damage and harm on other people.
I'm part of the Bible study group that's been reading the Bible cover to cover. And so I find what they're saying very refreshing because we're in the First Chronicles. So we just finished the litany of God being the commander-in-chief.
Yes.
Really being the one who, because the right intention says, kill the entire nation, kill the infants, plunder them, we any
Right.
place. And so, as Christians, we have this whole totality of our scriptures and this whole history of God at work in history. And our God has been a God of warfare.
Right.
And the way God's portrayed in his Old Testament writings really is the commander-in-chief. They pray that says, go, extend the territory here, extend the territory here. So an Old Testament scholar could very much just go to number one, right intention.
Yes.
And if it's the means to honor God, and then we've got zealots of any religion who hold that view.
That's right.
That I'm doing this in the name of God and honoring my God, and therefore I'm entitled to act on my faith. And so my question to you as a modern day, post-Christ Christian ethicist is how do we respond to our ethical code over history?
Right.
Where we've not been the pacifists, we've been the crusaders, we've been the invaders, we've been the
That's right.
in the name of God, if you will,
Right.
like that. So how do all that, I really love to be able to share that tomorrow with my group.
No pressure on any, Karen.
But it's very disturbing to modern day Christians
Sure.
to read our Old Testament history.
Yes.
Because it's not a history of compassion, on mercy, or sparing the innocent.
Right.
So,
Okay. Karen, I would argue, actually, in the Hebrew Bible, we see various responses to war. I mean, you read Deuteronomy 20, for instance, which sort of says you don't go in and turn it into a parking lot. You offer them the chance to surrender. And so then there's Exodus 4, I guess it is, which talks, in a sense, about not exercising the option. I would argue that in the Hebrew Bible, the crusade, the Holy War tradition, as I called it, comes out of the conquest narratives to establish Israel. So there it is a limited political objective that God is blessing this people, and he wants to give them this piece of real estate. Okay. And so God is the warrior in front of them. Some of the passages have this wonderful phrase, he sends the hornet in front of them. They're the hornets again. He sends the hornet in front of them, whatever that means. God is very much in control. It means Moses is not in control. Joshua is not in control. The kings are not in control. But God is the one who makes the choice about when to go to war. That is not something that is given to the earthly political leaders in Israel's day. It's God's choice, which he communicates clearly to whoever's in charge, to establish a single purpose, and that is to establish the sanctity and protection of Israel as a people, through which will become a divine blessing to the nation. So it's not just, I like these guys, I'm going to put them in charge and make them the big bad guys on the block. But he's putting them as the big guys on the block as a means to his end of blessing the entire world. That's in the Bible. That is, blessing all generations through Abraham. That is the original Abrahamic covenant. War is simply a means to that end that I think is a limited means. Okay. I don't think it's permissible for me today to say, you know, there's some really nasty people here that I don't like. So let me go back and quote Chronicles or Deuteronomy 20, and that's my authorization for the American army to go in and attack this other country. I think that's an illegitimate use of those scripture, because I think we have now in the teachings of Jesus, and even you remind me to talk about Romans 13 here in a second. The Apostle Paul talks about the limited use of force. He says in Romans 13 that the governing authorities they do not bear the sword in vain. They're there to punish the evildoer. So we have police forces today to punish evil people, to provide basic order for all of us to thrive in. It's not that Christians are to be the world's police. So I think we have to be careful in looking at these historical incarnations of either God's people as in the Jewish nation or God's people as Christians, and how they've acted on this question of war. I would give primacy to the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I would give primacy to the New Testament teaching we find in Romans 13, which gives me pause to say we're no longer in the Crusader era. That I know, I mean, God is not speaking to me, telling me who to attack and who to conquer. In fact, I don't think God is talking to any international leader in those terms today that seems to be going on in Israel's history. Does that make sense?
It's still a little disturbing that this war theory sort of convicts God in Second Chronicles. I mean, I think almost all Christians I've run into find it just disturbing. I mean, and it's that issue of complete destruction.
Right.
I think most people find so
Right.
alarming.
Call that ethnic cleansing today.
Well, we wouldn't call it is ethnic cleansing. And so the question
Right.
then arises, is that because they were in such a uncivilized time that if you didn't do it that way, these other tribes will come back on you eventually and will attempt to destroy you later? In other words, is it a binary time?
Well, I guess I'd frame it differently. I think that what God is trying to do is establish Israel to be a means of blessing the entire world. That ultimately is going to lead to the Messiah. I mean, I think that there's a clear argument throughout the Hebrew Bible that without Israel as a nation, there will not be a Messiah, and that the two are inextricably linked. So to the extent I can come up with a theological defense for these horrific passages that we see, it is God's mission, God's larger mission to the world, to save the world. Now, that still strikes us as very deplorable that people are dying in the process of this unfolding mission. And anybody who denies that's troubling, I don't think is paying attention, because it is troubling. I have no trump card answer that makes that go. We should be troubled by that. But what I'm really troubled by are contemporary Christians today who want to mine that holy war tradition and say, hey, you know what? I don't like those Iraqis. And if God let Israel do that to the Moabites, then God's going to let America do that against the Iraqis. That's why I blow the whistle and say, time out, well, we have a foul here. We need to stop. I hear more of that, frankly. I hear a lot of that. I also hear people saying, you got Jesus preaching peace in the Sermon on the Mount, and how do you reel the movie back a few minutes, and you've got utter destruction of non-Israelite people. How do you reconcile those? I've got no easy, cheap answer for that, other than what I've tried to give you to this point.
But is it, I think for me, the harder question isn't Christians who use the Holy War tradition for their own purposes. It's trying to apply that to the situation that is today.
Right.
In the larger context.
Yeah.
God wanted to give a piece of real estate to the people. They have it.
Right.
Now what? I mean,
Right, but I think where the analogy is discontinuous. I don't believe America is the heir to ancient Israel.
I'm not talking about America.
Yeah.
I'm actually talking about Israel.
Oh, well, okay, then that's another evening's complete discussion and debate. I'm not even going to begin to go down. Yeah, right. One of the best contemporary just war ethicists is Michael Walzer, who's a Jewish political philosopher, brilliant guy. And many of you maybe have suffered through his book, Just and Unjust Wars. The military reads it. They read it in international relations classes in college. I make my students read it. And he has a lot to say about the discontinuity between ancient Israel, in Deuteronomy 20, in the conquest narratives, and modern Israel. But so I'll just say read Michael Walzer and let me off the hook for the night.
John, I'm still stuck back on right intention. You know, I understand that as a democracy, we have a say in how our government acts. But how do we ever know, even personally, how are we ever sure our own intention?
Yeah.
Much less what our government's intention.
Well, again, I wish I could promise certitude, and you know better than anybody in this room, I can't, that it's still a good question to ask. What is your intention? I think that's a great question for any Christian to ask of themselves or to ask of a church. You want to do this. Help me understand what your intention is. Now, the problem is the really lousy political discourse we have today, and this is true of Democrats and Republicans. I'm an equal opportunity mud thrower here. We're not very good at asking our leaders, what is your intention here? And they're not very good at giving us good answers back. And we're even worse as a society having a discussion about what is your intention here? And I think that's where, as citizens, we have not done a good job. Now, eventually we do. And I think in Vietnam, over time, the country insisted on, why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish here? And we went through a series of presidents who kept giving really successively lousy answers to that question. And finally, the American people said, enough. So in a democracy with 300-something million people, it's going to be muddy, and it's going to take us a while to have that conversation. But we get in trouble, I think, when we stop asking that question, what is our intention? And as we know, wars sometimes start for these reasons, and they sometimes get sustained for those reasons. And when we're over in this region of those reasons, it's important to say, wait a minute, what happened to these reasons? And that's part of what democratic discourse is to be, is to stand up and say, excuse me, Senator, excuse me, Mr. President, what is your intention for doing this? So it's not, I like what the Virginia ethicist Jim Childress says, that right intention, it should not just be the first question we ask. That ought to be an ongoing question. Why are we here? Why are we doing this again? Remind me again why we're doing this? Because we might find ourselves 10 years later still fighting a war, and nobody can always remember why we're here. But I think that, Tom, tell me, I think pastorally, I think ecclesiastically, that's always I look at this as in your book, Bearing Fruit. That's one of the questions you're asking is, what is our intention here? Which means sometimes you say, we're no longer doing what we thought we were doing, let's stop. It empowers us to say no to something and to move on to something else.
So I think we're facing that right now in Afghanistan. These those reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
reason for that, I thought, was to get us on the bin Laden.
That's correct.
Now we've got this.
Right.
So why are we still there?
Well, I'll show my hand a little bit. I was against the Iraq War. I didn't think Iraq met these. Okay. I do, however, think there was a case to be argued about Afghanistan. Remember, we were in Afghanistan first because we went in, we had a stalemated civil war between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, and our belief was, and whether it's right or wrong, I'm in no position to judge, our belief was in order to get at the perpetrators of 9/11, we had to intervene in that civil war to get physical access to where they were at Tora Bora. So we intervened on the side of the Northern Alliance and against the Taliban as a means to an end to get to Osama bin Laden and to suppress al-Qaeda. And now, here we are, more than a decade later. I'm not sure the case still applies. And so I'm in complete agreement with you. Somewhere along the line, and I'm not naming names, I'm not blaming anybody, but somewhere along the line, it went from chasing and trying to punish the perpetrators of 9/11, which I think there was a legitimate moral case for that. But he's dead. And al-Qaeda doesn't seem, at this point at least, to have capacity to attack us. Now, somebody may disagree with that, and that's fine. But it is, I think the question is legitimate now. What is our intention in Afghanistan today? So this is a case where I think we took our eye off this ball somewhere in this arc of 11, 12 years, whatever it's been now. And so that, I think if that's a test case that says we should keep asking that question in particular. What are we trying to accomplish here? And because it wasn't, maybe we've lost our way.
One of the things that human beings really love to have is certainty, and of course, God doesn't give us that.
Right.
I just want to make a point that sometimes I think that asking of the question is much more important than whatever answer we come up with.
Right.
So, I think that that's what the point is, whether we can actually ascertain what the intention is the main reason for asking the question. The main reason for asking the question is to ask the question and then start the case.
No, I completely agree. But it also then empowers us to look back. I mean, part of the work of ethicists in the just war tradition is to look at the last war and say, what lessons can we learn from that maybe will help us in the future? To me, what was our intention in Afghanistan? Somebody need to rewrite that history looking back and chart the turns and ups and downs that took. That will be a great service, not only to weird ethicists like me, but it will be a good service to citizens and Christians to say, maybe we did lose our way when we turned this way instead of that way. So part of the work of ethicists is to look at cases that are done and in the books and to say, what can we might actually learn good things to avoid, or we might learn good things to repeat. So, I mean, that's why this ongoing question about drones is so important, is we're going to have to put our best minds to work on that, because it's not inconceivable we can find ourselves in a world where we have drones in the sky all the time, even here in the United States, which may not be where we want to go. So I take your point. I think I mentioned last week, students sometimes want me to have sort of two signs, yes and no, so that when somebody says, what about the war in Afghanistan? They want me to say yes, or they want me to say no, and I've got one that says, well, it depends. And that's part of the work of an ethicist, is to say, let's look at the wisdom in our Christian tradition and let's try to apply it as best we can, and see what can we learn to make us better Christians now and in the future. The power of the just war ethic I want to argue tonight is that it generates data, it generates, I think, wisdom. It doesn't make us kings, it doesn't make us omniscient, it doesn't give us moral certitude, but I would much rather wrestle with these questions before we go to war. I think we'll get smarter answers, better answers if we do, even though we may not disagree. And I think the really good news tonight, and this is my free editorial, we're just about out of time, and I've got 2 minutes. This is great. When the Iraq War broke out, or we were on the verge, I was the lowest member. I was a new kid on the block at Wesley Theological Seminary. I had done a dissertation on the just war ethic. And my phone started to ring, primarily from Methodist pastors, but a few Episcopal priests as well. And they said, looks like we're going to go to war. I kind of think maybe Christianity has something to say about war, but my church is 50-50, for the war, against the war. And if I say something, I'm going to lose half my church is going to be mad at me if I get up and sort of make them think I'm tilting. How about you come to my church? Now, being freshly minted PhDs are really dangerous people. Because we're not the brightest in the world. So I thought, well, of course I'll say yes. That's great. I get to go out. I get to meet people in churches. And then I thought, what in the world am I going to do? Because the same is going to apply to me. Those people are still going to be the same. They're not going to be different because the professor's up in front. If anything, it might be a little feistier. And I did two things. And I spoke probably to about a dozen churches within a fairly compressed period. And really only one of them handed my head back to me on a platter, which is kind of remarkable in retrospect. But what I said was, look, we have this wisdom, and this is biblically grounded. I mean, I can give you, in Romans 13 is where much of this comes from. We as Christians, we actually have some history on how to have this conversation. But how ironic is it that we ignore that? When we want to talk about war, where it's like Fox News versus MSNBC, right? That we go into that mode, and we forget that we have a history and a tradition. We have a God that's given us some wisdom. So I came in and said, this is kind of the history of your tradition. We have pacifism, we have just war, and I'm not going to endorse crusade for you this morning. And then finally at the end, I walked through I walked a rock through this and said, if anybody cares, this is where I stand. And I'm not assuming I'm going to move anybody 1 inch one way or the other. But the acid test for me is, can you disagree with me? And can we still take communion together and affirm each other as brothers and sisters that maybe disagree fairly fundamentally about something as important as Iraq? And if you can't, if my opinion on Iraq builds a wall between the two of us such that we can't have communion together, then we have a theological problem there. And unfortunately, what I saw in a lot of our churches was that kind of wall, that you're either with me or you're against me. Either you agree with me on Iraq, or I'm not looking at you as being a real brother and sister in Christ, worthy of sitting down and having the Lord's Supper together. That, my friends, is heresy. That is literally dividing the body of Jesus Christ. And we're doing it for political reasons. Now, I will still argue about, I was right about Iraq. I mean, I've got this stubborn Irish heritage, but I will do it under the belief that you are still my brother and sister, and I still have to demonstrate love to you in the deepest, most profound Christian sense of that, even though I may disagree with you about how this played out in that one case. My fear is the church has become so polarized on a number of political issues that our disagreements and arguments over policy prevents us from being able to have the true communion that's there for us uniquely in the Eucharist that we're supposed to take regularly. So I will leave you with that. Next week, we're going to talk about sanctification. Come back and I'll answer all your questions about sanctification. But what I really want us to look at is how are we transformed into holy people? How does that take place? And sanctification is one of those sort of Methodist franchise terms. If we can't get that right, nobody else can, all right? So come back and we'll stop with that. And thank you for your questions. I've kept you over time, but I appreciate the discussion tonight and hope you have a blessed week.